Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about 11 different masculine principled qualities that you can cultivate to integrate your masculine side. Alright, so this video is all about how to integrate the masculine side, and I'll be sharing with you 11 different archetypally masculine qualities that you can develop and integrate. And this video is for absolutely everyone because everyone has both a masculine side and a feminine side. On an energetic level, both of these are like two primordial energies that come together in every living and non-living system, including the human personality. And so it's a bit like yin and yang. So there's yin and yang in a tree, there's yin and yang in the cosmos, there's yin and yang within you and in your personality. And if you don't integrate the masculine, the feminine stagnates and doesn't grow. And if you don't integrate the feminine, the masculine stagnates and doesn't grow. So you need both of these polar energies to come together to create new growth within your personality. Now, I also recently made another video that's all about 11 feminine principled qualities that you can integrate, and I released that one just before this one. And in that video, I went over an important distinction that I'll also cover here. So there's a distinction between the cultural conception of masculinity and the archetypal masculine. So what I'm going to be covering here in this video doesn't have to do with the way our culture understands masculinity, because sometimes that coincides with kind of the energetic masculine and sometimes it diverges from that. So I'm going to be talking about like the energetic masculine in the sense of yang energy, and I'll also be talking about the archetypal masculine. Now, the archetypal masculine is that which has, generally been associated with the masculine principle and masculinity over, a variety of different cultures and eras. So you can think of the archetypal masculine as the type of things that would be associated with the masculine principle in things like artwork and folk tales and myths and things like this. Now, in the video that I made before about the feminine, I talked about how getting in touch with the feminine was largely a subtractive process of removing one's resistances to the feminine. So the feminine principle has a lot to do with being, and so it's not something that you do. And so part of it is just allowing something to be there, dropping the defenses, dropping the resistance. With the masculine principle, part of it is dropping the resistances, but because the masculine principle has to do with doing instead of being, there's a lot more action that's necessary to integrate and develop the masculine side. So one of the main challenges of integrating the feminine is to drop resistance to what is, and the main challenge with the masculine side is to develop and to change what is and to transform it into something else. Now, before I get going with sharing the masculine principled traits, there are a few caveats that I wanted to share before we get into that, because I think that these could serve as a kind of stumbling block going forward to integrating and developing the masculine. So one of the things that I had mentioned before is that the masculine and feminine are like two sides to one coin. So if you don't integrate the feminine, the masculine side stagnates and vice versa. And so basically there's a common social pattern that I've noticed among boys and younger men in particular, but also this can happen with like men of any age, where there's a thought of like valuing the masculine and trying to add more masculinity to themselves and subtract femininity from themselves. So it's to see that, to be masculine means to not be feminine and to push that away, to see femininity as antithetical to masculinity. But again, because these two energies have to kind of come together in order for there to be growth and development, what ends up happening is that if, let's say, there's a resistance to the feminine, the masculine side stays at its lower levels of development. So one of the things I described in the last video is basically like, I like to think about the masculine and feminine as like two poles within the infinity symbol. So let's say over here you have the masculine side and over here you have the feminine side. And so what you want is you want to have a full circuit, and then you can kind of grow up from there and you can kind of expand and, let's say, bring yourself to higher levels of development, including your masculinity. And so if somebody has polarized themselves over into the masculine to the exclusion of the feminine, what happens is that growth and that change can't happen. And so in order to really develop your masculine side, you have to also develop the feminine side, or at least drop resistance to the feminine side. Now, like I had said before, the masculine principle has primarily to do with doing, while the feminine principle has to do with being. And so, if it's the case that we don't integrate the positive feminine principle, what's going to happen is that the negative elements of the feminine principle will come up and thwart our progress. And so, let's say, for example, I feel like I need to achieve something in order to validate my own existence. So I feel like I need to do something in order for my being to be okay and to be valid. So this is an indication of a polarization into the masculine principle to the exclusion of the feminine. And so what's going to happen is that the negative feminine principled qualities, so like let's say if being is the positive, things like laziness and stagnation are more like the negative form of that. And so the negative form of the feminine will come in and will stagnate the masculine principled growth. So you won't be able to develop the positive masculine because the negative feminine will come in if you don't integrate the positive feminine. Whereas if you're able to integrate the positive feminine principled quality of being, where you feel valid and valuable just as you are and okay to be, it kind of gives you this platform to where it's like, okay, well now the achievement doesn't have these high stakes. This achievement doesn't require me to devalue myself if I don't pull things off. So counterintuitively, if you want to develop your masculine side, one of the most effective things you can do is to become acquainted with the feminine principled qualities and to drop resistance to your feminine side. Because so often it tends to be this polarization when we value masculinity really, really strongly, but we don't see the value in the feminine. We see it as antithetical to the masculine. When we start seeing the feminine as antithetical to the masculine, what's going to happen is we're going to run into all sorts of different stumbling blocks. And so what we want to do is we want to cultivate a sense of wholeness. So in this video, I'm not only going to be talking about the masculine principle, I'm also going to be talking a bit about the feminine principled counterpart to the masculine principled qualities that actually will help that masculine principled growth happen. Now, one more caveat before we get into the video. Ultimately, you cannot add masculinity or femininity to yourself, and you cannot take masculinity or femininity away from yourself. Like I had said, the masculine and feminine are in all living and non-living systems and are part of our innate self. So you can't have a fundamental change on that level. You can only integrate and develop what's there, or you have the choice to repress it. So if you happen to be thinking, oh no, if I integrate my masculine side, I'm going to be less feminine, or oh no, if I integrate my feminine side, I'm going to be less masculine, this is just not possible. You have both of these energies within you. They're going to be there no matter what. They're always unchanging. So you're not going to, in integrating the masculine side, suddenly become more masculine. You're not going to lose your femininity. So I just wanted to mention that also as a caveat. All right, so the first masculine principled quality that I'm going to be sharing is individualism, with its feminine principled counterpart, collectivism. So with the feminine principle has a lot to do with connection and socialization and belonging to a group. Whereas the masculine has to do with individuality and, being able to travel to the beat of our own drum. So it's the ability to kind of stand out, the ability to break free from the collective. And so basically personal growth and individuation is a very masculine principled kind of thing. And if a person lives in a community that's more collectivist in nature, what's going to be emphasized is the roles that people play and how people kind of sublimate themselves into the group for the benefit of the greater whole. Whereas like the masculine principle is more like individual growth and achievement. It's sort of this idea of like serving the society by standing out, doing your own thing. So thinking about it as like, let's say the feminine principle is more about duty, whereas the masculine principle is more about achievement on this level. And the positive elements of this are like new growth, more authenticity, the ability to shine one's own light, and kind of like breaking through new barriers. You see, when you have to move together as a group, you move very slowly, but an individual can go at their own pace and can move very quickly. Now, the more negative elements of, let's say, integrating individualism or being excessively individualistic is lack of connection, no social support, and kind of almost like Atlas's issue with having the weight of the world on one's shoulders. And so in order to, let's say, temper out the excesses of individualism, being able to integrate collectivism can be quite helpful for that. So being able to also remain connected and supported by others while you also go on your individualistic journey is helpful. And you can develop this quality more by being willing to rebel a little bit, being willing to be bold and to be different. All right, so the next masculine principled trait I'm going to be talking to you about is intellect, with its feminine counterpart, the instinct. So ultimately, the mind is the masculine principle and the body is the feminine principle. And so basically, with the feminine principle, with the body, we get instincts, we get emotions, we get urges, we get, all sorts of different intuitions that come up. And these don't come up in an intellectual format, so we don't get it in the form of words and symbols. It's just kind of like a feeling that comes up on the level of the body. And so in order for our mind to be keyed into that, we have to be able to organize those kind of, sort of just raw instincts and intuitions and urges and things like that into words, into a format that the intellect can understand. What can happen is that if we haven't developed the masculine principled quality of intellect, and if we are disconnected from our feminine principled connection to the body, what can happen is that the body will be sending us messages and we'll know it without knowing it. So we'll have a sense about things, but until we put words to it, until we can connect those two elements of mind and body, we won't be able to be intellectually aware of things. And so we'll be aware of things on some level, but we won't really be consciously aware of it in the way that having something in a kind of like word-based format that we can kind of think through allows us to be aware of things. So I like to call this process of converting the body's messages to us into an intellectual format, I like to call it crystallization. And the reason why I call it that is because one of the archetypal symbols for the feminine and for the emotions and the intuition and things like that come up on the level of the body is the element of water. So if you notice, like if you try to grab a hold of water, it's actually quite difficult to hold on to. But if you put water in the freezer, it starts to crystallize. It starts to have this organized, solid structure that you can then grab a hold of quite easily. And so whenever we're developing the masculine principled quality of intellect, what we're doing is we're essentially taking the emotions and the instincts and the urges and all of the intuitions of the body, and we're crystallizing that into a solid format that's graspable from the perspective of the conscious mind. And along these same lines, the masculine more generally has to do with taking that which is in its raw natural form as it appears in nature, as it appears in the body, and then kind of crystallizing it and putting it into some kind of simpler geometric structure that's easier for human beings to navigate and grasp. And really, the instincts are the wisdom of the body. And really, the instincts, the emotions, the intuition, these are all part of nature. They are our nature element. And so basically, when we can use the masculine principled element of intellect, we can actually start to organize those things in such a way that's more ergonomic for our mind to use, essentially. All right, so the next masculine principled quality that we're going to be exploring is organization, with its feminine principled counterpart of organic arrangement. Now, we could also call this order and chaos. So ultimately, the masculine principle is order and the feminine principle is chaos. And so we could say that the masculine principle is associated with geometry quite a bit. This is oftentimes why the divine masculine is associated with like sacred geometry. So it has to do with simple geometric order on the masculine side, whereas the feminine principle is nature itself. And so basically what we have is we have a lot more, there's still order within nature, but it's a very chaotic order from the perspective of human beings. So there's all sorts of complex ecosystems and feedback loops, And from the perspective of the human being, this is very, very chaotic for us, So if we tried to live out in the woods, without any type of, let's say, civilized structure that we're living in that's more geometric in nature, that would be very dangerous for us. So when human beings conceptualize of something that's chaotic, what they mean is something that's not conducive to human survival, basically, is what that is. And so basically what the masculine principle does is it takes the rawness of nature and it reorders it and alchemizes it into something that's safe and easy to navigate from the human perspective. And that's where the organization and the geometry comes into play. So from the perspective of a human being, nature is very chaotic. The bears will eat you, you'll drown in the ocean, the mosquitoes will give you malaria, the hurricanes will blow you away, and if you go into the woods and you get lost, you might never come out again. So a big part of the masculine principle is taking that which is chaotic in nature and then basically ordering it and shaping it into something that's of ergonomic use to human beings. So we take a tree and we chop it down and we make a house from it, or we make paper from it, or we take iron out of the ground and we shape it into cooking utensils and weapons, or we take coals out of the mines and then basically we burn that coal for energy and for fuel and things like this. So we take the elements of nature that in its raw form are unhelpful to us, and we turn it and we alchemize it into a form that's more ordered and let's say ergonomically, so that it helps human beings. And we build towns and cities that are full of right angles and geometric shapes, and our homes are made from right angles and geometric shapes. And then when we organize our home, we take all of the organically shaped things and we put them inside of other geometric forms like cabinets and boxes and drawers. And so we're always taking the chaotic elements and we're organizing them into these geometric forms. And degenerating into entropy and being devoured by the powerful forces of Mother Nature has been one of the primary fears since the dawn of human existence and all the way up until the Industrial Revolution from the perspective of wealthier societies. And because of this, the question has always been, how do we polarize as much as possible into the masculine ordering principle to keep Mother Nature from devouring us into the chasm of its guts? Now, to take this down into more microcosmic terms in terms of how you can integrate the masculine principled quality of organization, you want to look around your environment. Are you in an orderly space, or are you in a space that's really messy and really chaotic? And so if you notice that there's a lot of chaos in your space, not a lot of organization, you want to use the discipline in order to bring things back into that masculine ordering principle where everything is kind of geometrically organized and everything looks nice and neat and orderly and tidy. And this is basically what Jordan Peterson talks about, when he says clean your room. And that's because, let's say, when it comes to the masculine ordering principle of geometry, it's things have to be constantly upkept in order to keep things from falling into a state of entropy. And when things fall into a state of entropy, they fall back into the chaotic forms of nature. So if we don't clean our room constantly, if we don't upkeep that, what's going to happen is that our room is going to start resembling nature more and more and more. And so the order of our room will get complex, chaotic, and less livable from the perspective of the human being. So being able to apply the masculine ordering principle to your room is helpful. Now, a caveat that I would mention here is that if you find yourself constantly with your room in a state of entropy, and if your room is more like a jungle and it's it starts really resembling the ordering principle of nature, consider that your issue is maybe not the masculine, but that your issue is the feminine. So if you feel disconnected from nature in some way, if you feel disconnected from your body, if maybe you don't go outside too much, if you feel just generally disconnected from the feminine principle, you might be creating a chaotic situation around yourself by keeping your room in a mess where you have to connect with the feminine principle. So this is what I had mentioned before. If we don't integrate the feminine in its positive form, like being connected to nature and being connected to the body and other feminine principled qualities, what's going to happen is it's going to creep in some other negative kind of way where we'll get the negative feminine principled quality like chaos, and our environment will be a total mess. So if your issue is rooted in the masculine with regard to organization and chaos, what you'll want to do is you'll want to develop the discipline to be more ordered. If your issue is with the feminine, you'll want to actually connect to the chaos of the feminine in some other healthy form so that it doesn't start creeping in and creating chaotic situations in your life. And consider that the unconscious form of goddess worship is the most dangerous kind. All right, this brings us to our next masculine principled quality, which is evergreenness, while the feminine principle is deciduousness. So I relate this to like evergreen and deciduous trees. So evergreen trees stay green all year, but deciduous trees, they are green some parts of the year, and then the leaves turn color, and then they fall off, and they're bare another part of the year, and then they go back through this cycle again and again. And so consistency is part of the masculine principle, and changes and cycles are part of the feminine principle. Think about it in relation to the sun and moon. So basically the sun is reflective of the masculine principle and the moon is reflective of the feminine principle. These are really common archetypal masculine and feminine symbols. And so the sun has actually a 24-hour cycle, and it rises and sets the same way every day. But the moon actually has a 28-day cycle, and so it shows up in all sorts of different phases. So every day it's very, very different, So sometimes it's a full moon, and sometimes it's a waxing moon, and a waning moon, and a half moon, and a quarter moon, and the new moon. So the feminine principle has a lot to do with attunement and, kind of changing and tweaking things based off of the situation, while the masculine principled element of consistency means that you show up the same way every single time. And so there's a discipline element to this as well. So basically, it's sort of like, can you show up to work every single day and be on your A game every single time, without there being kind of ups and downs, and sometimes you're doing better and sometimes you're doing worse. And so if you want to develop consistency, it's sort of like being able to develop certain principles that you always go back to every time. And so this is a big part of developing certain virtues and certain things like work ethic and things like that. Can you show up the same way every single time? Can you show up virtuous, without letting your emotional state or, the changes of the day, impact you that much? Now, a word of warning with this. If we always feel like we have to show up consistently every single day without regard to our emotions, and we don't create space for the changes in our emotional state in some other place, what's going to happen is it'll create a pressure cooker kind of situation where you might have a breakdown. So you want to integrate the feminine principled polarity of change in some kind of way so that it doesn't come in and sabotage your masculine principled principles. All right, so the next masculine principled quality we're going to be exploring is detachment with its feminine principled counterpart, immersion. So let's imagine that there is a city. What the feminine principled perspective on that is a more immersive perspective of the city, where you're down on the street view and you're taking in all of the sensory experiences, you're hearing all the sounds, and you're smelling all the smells, and you're seeing all of the sights. Now, the masculine principled perspective is more like a bird's eye view of that same city. And so you don't get any of those more immersive details, you're more detached, but you're able to see things in a more big picture kind of way. And you're able to kind of get the broad strokes of what the city looks like. So you're like, okay, this building is next to that building and this intersection intersects with that intersection. So when you're down on the street view, you can't see any of those things. But when you're up in the bird's eye view, you can get this different perspective that allows you to kind of make more strategic decisions because you can see how things relate together in the big picture. So in order to develop more detachment, what we want to do is we want to develop the ability to get distance from things and to back up and to get a clearer perspective through that distance. So if we find ourselves, let's say, bogged down in something and we're not sure what to do, we want to be able to get a little bit of space and then be able to see what the best strategic decision is to make from there. But we also want to toggle back and forth between the details and the big picture as well. So it's kind of like being able to go between both of those perspectives, the zoomed in perspective and the zoomed out perspective, is something that, is just a best practice for being able to go about whatever it is that you're doing that requires that big picture perspective. All right, the sixth masculine principle quality that we're going to be exploring into is machination with its feminine principled counterpart of spontaneity. Now, as I'd mentioned before, the masculine principle has a lot to do with organization and geometry. And so along with this comes the masculine principled polarity of machination, when things work in a very machine-like way. So machination includes things like protocols, games, rules, machines, algorithms, institutions, and systems in general. Ultimately, it's anything that's a system that works the same exact way every single time. And these machination-based systems operate off of the logic-based axiom of the premise and the conclusion. So it's if this, then that. And so if we want to incorporate the masculine principled quality of machination into our lives, if we're business owners, maybe we create some kind of automatic sales funnel that automatically puts our sales process on automatic. That could be like one example of it. But for just like the average everyday person, we use machination whenever we're setting solid habits for ourselves. So for example, if I want to make sure that I do yoga every day for 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the evening, well, I want to make that as automatic as possible. And so the way I would do that is I would try to build mechanistic habits that I don't even have to think about, that I just kind of can go into in this kind of automatic way. So we all have habits that are automatic to us. They get ingrained. And so what we want to do is we want to choose positive and beneficial automatic habits to kind of put into our daily repertoire. And when machination is integrated in a healthy way, and we build these positive habits for ourselves, what happens is this frees up a lot of energy for us to do the things that we really want to do in a more spontaneous manner. But whenever machination is overdone, everything has to be organized into a system and there's no spontaneity to be had. And so everything becomes kind of robotic. And so what we want to do is if we find ourselves, like let's say, not installing the habits that we want to develop more of that masculine principled machination. But if you find yourself only making decisions based off of machination, you want to integrate the more of the spontaneity element. All right, so the next masculine principled trait that we're going to explore is logic with its feminine counterpart, the intuition. So with logic, like I had said before, it's always if this, then that. So there's a premise and there's a conclusion. And so basically with, let's say, a particular premise, if we are basing things off of a false premise, we could have a perfectly logical statement that's not true at all. So for example, if I say, if the world is flat, then it makes good sense that we could fall off the edge of the world. Well, ultimately, it's not a true statement, but it is a logical statement. And so this is one of the important things to recognize with logic, because when we realize what logic is really for and what it's really useful for, it can be helpful. So logic isn't a good tool for determining what's true. Logic is a good tool for determining what would make good rational sense if something were true. And so logic is great for coming up with new possibilities and thinking into brand new areas of things. And so there's a rational component, but it's a lot more interesting than just pure rationality. When we use logic, we can really come up with all sorts of new ideas and we can test those out and we can kind of explore them to their most logical conclusions. For example, Einstein was using logic when he first came up with his inspiration that led him to discover the theory of relativity. So he had asked himself the question of like, if I were able to ride on a bicycle right next to a beam of light, and I were able to go at the same speed as the speed of light, and I were to look over, then what would I see? And he came up with the kind of like, let's say, hypothesis that if he were to do that, he would then see a magnetic field at rest. So it's sort of like if this, then that. If I were riding a bicycle next to a beam of light, then it makes sense if I look over, I'm going to see a magnetic field at rest. And so with that logic-based inspiration, he actually did a lot of, let's say, studying into that, and he actually found that to be true. And that's how he discovered the theory of relativity. So logic is a great masculine principled quality to be able to develop. Not only does it help you kind of sharpen your rational thinking skills, it also helps you like explore into new possibilities. But also I'll give the caveat that logic is not the end-all be-all, and if you're making all of your decisions based off of logic and rationality, you'll want to tap into the intuition and the sort of the gut reaction to get a sense of what you really truly want in your heart of hearts. All right, the eighth masculine principled quality that we're going to be talking about is concentrated awareness with its feminine counterpart of diffuse awareness. So concentrated awareness is basically like focus. So if you can imagine that, let's say, concentrated awareness or focus is like a laser beam, while the feminine principled diffuse awareness is kind of like a lamp that, a diffuser lamp, that just lights up its immediate area. And so diffuse awareness is really good if we're like multitasking. We have a lot of things to do at once. So let's say that we're cooking some kind of 5-course meal or something, and we have a lot of different things going at once. We got stuff in the oven, we got stuff on every stovetop, everything has like a different time. We can't focus intensely on one particular thing, otherwise the other thing will be neglected. And so that's what the diffuse awareness is good for. But with, let's say, the masculine principled, like concentrated awareness and focus, it's something that's like we get just very deeply immersed into just one thing at a time. So let's say that there's a painter and they're focused so entirely on what they're painting that it's almost like the entire world tunes out around them. Or let's say there's an inventor who's inventing something and the whole world tunes out around them. And so in order to develop the masculine principle, we want to develop the ability to focus single-pointedly on just one task at a time. Now, the positive of this are the ability to get things done, to get results with one particular thing. Now, some of the negatives that can come along with concentrated awareness is tunnel vision, where we sort of edit out things that are actually very important for us to focus on. And so if you find yourself, let's say, experiencing tunnel vision, you'll want to integrate the feminine principled quality of diffuse awareness. But if you find yourself having difficulty focusing, difficulty bringing your point of focus to one single point, what you're going to want to do is maybe practice something like mindfulness meditation, which is all about like being able to come back to your object of focus, and to be able to focus on that, just purely that one thing. So for example, the object of focus is usually the breath. And so the mind will start trying to take you off into all sorts of different places, and then you just bring your awareness back to the breath. And so basically through this practice, you start to learn more and more how to bring yourself into that focused state automatically. All right, the ninth masculine principled quality that we're going to be discussing is product orientation with its feminine counterpart of process orientation. So the feminine principle is all about the journey, and the masculine principle is all about the destination. So when we're engaging in the process of something and simply enjoying the process, that engages the feminine principle. But when we're trying to get a certain result, that requires the development of the masculine principle. So the masculine principle is very much results focused, very much about like, okay, what's the outcome at the end of what we're doing? So when it comes to something like a game, so let's say like a sports game, the feminine ethos is like, it doesn't matter if you win or lose, it's how you play the game. The masculine ethos is sort of like play to win. Make sure that you come out victorious. Make sure you get the result that you're looking for. Now, one of the things that I had mentioned in relation to this in the feminine principled qualities video is that the masculine is really like a journey up the mountain toward the peak. So the point is to get to the peak of the mountain. And so we climb the mountain to get to that end. And so basically, whenever we have a solid trajectory and a North Star that we're following, and whenever we have a certain goal that we want to get to, we have to engage that masculine principled quality of product orientation. And to develop this quality, you want to always begin with the end in mind. So let's say if you have some kind of goal in your career or in your business or something like that, you want to get the sense of what are the outcomes that I want to achieve and what has to happen in order for me to get those outcomes. So be very clear about the results you want and go very deliberately toward those results. All right, the next masculine principled quality that we're going to be talking about is giving with its feminine principled counterpart of receiving. So basically this is in relation to two archetypes that are, sort of like twin archetypes. So we have the lover archetype and we have the beloved archetype. So the lover is the masculine principled archetype, which is all about giving love unconditionally, while the beloved, which is the feminine principled archetype, which is all about receiving love unconditionally. And so when we're trying to engage our masculine principled side, what we want to do is we want to be thinking about how do we want to be of service to others? How do we want to give of ourselves to others? Now the earth is reflective of the feminine and the sun is reflective of the masculine. And so it's sort of like the sun just gives its rays to earth and it engenders some kind of positive change in the earth. Like things grow because the sun shines on it. We want to think about, let's say, if we're going to tap into our masculine principled quality, how can we be the sun in someone's life? How can we give them things like encouragement or support or acts of service that are going to actually help them grow, and help them get to a better place? So that's a big part of the masculine, is being a supportive force for others and to be able to essentially shine our light just naturally so that other people can benefit from it. Now, one of the negative expressions of this can be when we don't have the feminine principled quality of receiving integrated. And so what we keep trying to do is we keep trying to pour from an empty cup. We keep trying to give when we don't have anything to give. Ideally, what we'll do is we'll receive to the point that our cup is completely full, and such that the cup just overflows, so that we're not having to sacrifice ourselves in order to give to others. But the giving just comes naturally as a result of receiving and not in a transactional way. All right, so the next masculine principled quality we're going to be talking about is purification, with its feminine principled counterpart of integration. So with purification, it's basically taking that which is dirty and cleaning it, taking that which is tainted and bringing it back to its original form. Whereas like the feminine principle is all about accepting everything that is, accepting the good, accepting the bad, accepting the ugly. And it takes some wisdom to know which of these is the best thing to use in any given situation. So for example, if we're engaging in shadow work is largely feminine principled, first off because it's an internal thing, and the internal is the feminine, the external is the masculine. But there's also the need to accept all parts of the self, to love all parts of the self. And so if we go about our inner work process by trying to purify ourselves and by trying to always improve ourselves and be better, we can actually end up pushing elements of ourself away and end up creating shame for parts of ourself. So if we try to use purification in our shadow work practice, it can kind of backfire. Whereas if we use integration, we actually are able to connect to the inherent purity that's already there. So it's not something we have to clean up. It's something that once we accept it and once we shine our light and acceptance on it, then that's what actually leads to the purification, as opposed to trying to say, oh, this is the bad thing, let's get rid of the bad thing. Now, certain other things require purification. So for example, if you're cleaning your house, what you do is you're taking contaminants out of something. Or, let's say if you're, cleaning things up in general, like anything like that is all about taking the contaminants up. Or maybe, let's say you're in a friend group and let's say maybe there are people there that are, not so pleasant to be around. And so you clean up your friend group, you purify it of, let's say, negative influences. So being able to select the situations where you use purification and the situations where you use integration is really, really helpful. And so you want to think about the question of is there a contaminant here that needs to be gotten rid of? And you don't want to misdiagnose a contaminant. So for example, if we're looking at our inner work process and we determine that certain aspects of ourself are a contaminant, well, what we're doing is we're actually going against parts of ourself that are not a contaminant at all, but an integral part of ourself. So integration is necessary there. But conversely, let's say that we're in a situation where we notice that we have a lot of bad habits, and basically these bad habits are leading to negative results. It's in these situations, this is the time to utilize purification to actually remove those contaminants from our life and to cultivate better habits. So some ways that you can use purification are things like, okay, are there any habits that you want to change? Or maybe if you're eating really unhealthy food and you want to start eating more healthy food, that would be a great way to practice purification. Also, along with the organization and the tidiness element, you can also become really cleanly and hygienic. That's a great way to exercise purification. There's also a kind of purification that can happen through integration as well. So it's basically whenever we start to connect with parts of ourselves and, basically let's say we have an aspect that's been pushed into the shadow and now we're integrating with it. Well, now we're in touch with all of its like negative emotion and all of its pain. And through that connection, we start to be able to process through that pain and eventually let go of it. And that leads to a kind of purification. So in this case, it's an integration that leads to a purification. All right, so those are the 11 masculine principled qualities and their feminine principled counterparts. I hope that's helpful for you guys for becoming more whole and just developing your masculine principled potentials in general. And anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, if you would like to learn about the shadow and shadow work, check out my free shadow integration masterclass called the 6 Simple Steps to Shadow Integration. And you can go there by going to shadowintegration.org/masterclass. All right, and that's all I have for you for now. And until next time, keep becoming more you.